Good evening. Good evening, folks. It is my extreme honor and privilege to welcome you to the 2022 Noyce Summit, where we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Noyce program. We are just ecstatic to be able to welcome you for an in-person gathering. We know that this community, which has such a vibrant history of meeting, has been longing to come back together. We hope that we can do that in as safe a way as possible. We encourage you all to please exercise your agency around meeting in person as you feel most comfortable. Masking as you feel most comfortable. Please feel free to ask others to mask around you if that is more safe for you or for your family members. But we are just so excited to welcome you all. My name is Travis York. I serve as the director of AAAS's Inclusive STEM Ecosystems for Equity and Diversity Initiative, formerly known as Education and Human Resources. And again, it really is a pleasure to be with you all tonight. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is provided at the beginning of a gathering by naming the traditional native inhabitants of the land in order to recognize and respect native peoples and to cultivate deeper awareness of the history that has led to the present moment. As the son of a very proud half Choctaw Quarter Cherokee man, I am honored to gather with you all today. We wish to gratefully acknowledge all of the diverse and vibrant Indigenous peoples whose ancestral homelands many of us live and work. Today we acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Indigenous Piscataway and the Takshatonk or Anacostan peoples. And we pay our respect to the elders, and both past and present. At AAAS, our Inclusive STEM Ecosystems for Equity and Diversity department seeks to reimagine and reconstruct the STEM enterprise in a way that leverages society's diversity to advance science and serve society. The Noyce community is at the very heart of this work. And we are so excited to gather with you all the next several days to advance that work, both within Noyce and within your institutions, within your schools, within your communities. The PIs, co-PIs, fellows, master teachers, and other STEM professionals surrounding you at this conference work tirelessly, conducting research, developing strategies and methods, pedagogies that are all aimed at increasing the uptakes of strategies that will improve the way we teach and learn STEM so that everyone can benefit. We hope that this conference gives you a platform not only to share your amazing work, but to listen and learn from other Noyce grantee awardees. One great way to jumpstart that learning is with a hot off the presses copy of our new Track 4 research volume titled Research and Practice, Preparing and Retaining K-12 STEM Teachers in High-Need School Districts, coming from your very own community. We literally had these delivered yesterday from the printer, and we're so excited. Congratulations to all of the authors in this room. As you can see, copies are available by the registration desk, and we'll be putting out some more if you haven't gotten one. And for those of you who might be a little close to your weight limits for flights, we do have it available electronically. It is a hefty volume, which is pretty exciting work. Over the next 2 days, you will meet Noyce grantees who are reimagining the resources and methods for STEM teacher education and STEM learning across the country. Many are researching how we can continue to recruit, retain, train our nation's highly skilled STEM teacher workforce. In particular, we hope that there is an opportunity here for you to continue to flesh out your network, your support structure, the community that will sustain you in your work, in your research, in your teaching, in your careers. Over the next few days, I hope you will take some time to reflect as you learn from each other on how this relates to your institutions, your schools, your department, your colleagues, your classrooms, your students, and yourself. Together, we can not only imagine, but we can enact a just, equitable, and inclusive STEM enterprise. Now, enough with me. I'm not the main attraction here. We have a powerhouse of incredible speakers over the next several days, and tonight's opening plenary is no exception. I am happy very much to introduce you to a continued partner of ours in all of this work. The National Science Foundation has been at the heart, obviously, of the Noyce program, but of so many other programs around STEM teaching and learning. And this 20th year celebration, I think, is a great representation of that. And I'm very happy to share that we have Dr. Karen Maringell, who serves as the Chief Operating Officer from the National Science Foundation, to offer some greetings and welcome. Having served in her current role for just over a year, Dr. Maringell previously led the NSF Directorate for Education and Human Resources. Dr. Maringell is a leader in the STEM education research community, and her career has been marked by a deep commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. She has led the funding of several STEM education research centers focused on broadening participation and initiatives to address equity and inclusion in STEM. Prior to joining NSF, Dr. Maringell served as Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Portland State University. Dr. Maringell has a bachelor's degree in mathematics and philosophy from Albright College, a master's degree in mathematics from Lehigh University, and a doctoral degree in mathematics education from the University of New Hampshire. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Travis, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is really a pleasure to kick off this first day of the 2022 Noyce Summit and celebrate 20 years of the Noyce program. Let's all give ourselves a round of applause for that. It's hard to imagine that it has been over 2 years since we last convened together, but that is the case, and a lot has happened in those 2 years. And before I get started making some remarks on that and the state of science and teaching in general, I do want to take a moment to thank our partners at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, for all that they do to continue to provide support for this program here today, and for making this year's summit a possibility, and for all of their support for the Noyce program throughout the year. Organizing an event like this is never an easy task, and they have developed a fantastic agenda for the next few days, so congratulations and thank you, AAAS. I also want to extend a special thank you to my colleagues at the National Science Foundation, the Robert Noyce Teacher Scholarship Program team members at NSF, for their hard work and their dedication to the program. All of their continued efforts and successes remain critical to the NSF mission and to the future of our nation's robust STEM enterprise. So thank you, NSF staff, and congratulations to you. And finally, I want to thank everyone here today for your commitment to our nation's educators and your efforts to expand effective STEM education across the country. Each and every day, you are working hard to ensure that our K-12 STEM teachers and leaders exist in every community across the nation. You are helping us reach our goal that every student has an equitable education, and you are also contributing to the prosperity of our nation by helping all learners succeed in the future workforce and developing our next generation of STEM leaders and STEM teacher leaders. So a big hand to all of you. As many of you know, the National Science Foundation was created by Congress in 1950 in recognition of the increasingly profound impact scientific research could have on the nation's economy, our global leadership, and our nation's well-being. And more than ever, we are witnessing the amazing impact STEM disciplines can have on our lives and communities. I think we can all agree that the past 2 years alone have dramatically underscored this. Now we are being challenged by our nation's leaders on both sides of the aisle to succeed in an intensely competitive environment, to dramatically expand our nation's innovation capacity, and to strengthen our STEM communities by mobilizing the unrealized talent embedded throughout the nation. To rise to this challenge, NSF is working hard to expand and create opportunities across the country at all levels of education that open new doors to STEM for our nation's students and advance the equity and quality of STEM education everywhere. And we are proud of the progress we are making. But we know at NSF that without our nation's K-12 teachers, these opportunities really don't mean very much. NSF's programs and awards can open new doors to STEM experiences, but it is our teachers who continue to show our students the incredible opportunities that await. Our nation's teachers, as you know, inspire, motivate, mentor students throughout their education and make lasting impacts on every individual they work with. NSF's efforts today would not be possible if our nation did not have such dedicated teachers who tirelessly demonstrate their commitment to their craft and ensure their students have the best educational experiences our country can provide. That is why we are so incredibly proud of the achievements of the Robert Noyce Teacher Scholarship Program and what achievements it has made over the past 20 years. What this program and all of you have achieved is truly remarkable. Since its inception in 2002, the Noyce program has made over 1,000 awards that stretch across 49 states and territories, and has produced over 12,000 educators who are currently teaching or have taught primarily in high-need schools. On top of that, the program supports an average of 2,000 scholars and fellows each year who continue to achieve amazing things that are transforming the way our country teaches STEM. And that scholarship and research, in addition to the practice that we support through this program, are so important to the future of education, STEM education in our country. We have made incredible progress, but we must recognize that our work is not yet done, and I know you all know this. We know that these last few years have challenged our teachers like never before. As the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the country, students and teachers alike had to reskill, upskill, and adapt. Seemingly overnight, entire classrooms shifted to digital platforms. Science labs were conducted using virtual reality and simulations, and lessons were streamed live to our homes. Soon after, these same teachers were challenged to develop hybrid educational models and to teach under constantly uncertain and changing circumstances. And for many of you in this room, you were doing double duty by both going through this yourselves and trying to support teachers as they were going through this in their own classrooms. Oh, and being parents on top of all of that too. No one's tired these days. We must recognize that the challenges and the stresses associated with the pandemic, as well as the ever-evolving educational and technological landscapes, are testing our teachers and driving up attrition rates across the country. And we know that this trend was happening before the pandemic, and like so many things during the pandemic, it was exacerbated and brought to light. A 2021 EdWeek Research Center survey noted that over 50% of teachers interviewed last year were somewhat or very likely to leave the profession within the next 2 years. I know that's not a statistic that surprises anyone in this room. And a recently released report from the National Center for Education Statistics shows that nearly half of our nation's public schools currently report full or part-time teaching vacancies. We have moved beyond a critical point with our teaching force. At the same time, new and evolving technologies like robotics, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing continue to transform the way societies manufacture goods and materials, provide vital services, collaborate, and of course, learn. STEM education and training is no longer just for future scientists and engineers. Nearly every job is becoming more technical, and the demand for STEM knowledge and skills continues to spread throughout the U.S. economy. So there is an urgent and critical need for a digitally literate workforce that is trained to succeed in an intersecting array of STEM disciplines and skills. The convergence of all of this shows why it is important more than ever to ensure that we are giving our nation's STEM teachers the tools, the training, the support, and frankly, the love that they need to meet the challenges of today and to succeed year after year so that every student, no matter who they are or where they are from, can receive equitable access to these incredible STEM educators. This week, your agenda is full of unique opportunities to work together and learn from one another, and I hope and I know that you will take full advantage of that. It's my hope that these sessions will inspire you to have new ideas and to also share your best practices and experiences, and we do need that sharing of best practices to take place. I encourage you to take time to reflect on how we can continue to recruit, train, and retain our nation's STEM teachers while considering the growing challenges we now face. And I encourage each of you to ask yourself and your colleagues, how do we best ensure that we are fostering and developing critical STEM skills in all learners, regardless of location or background? Every community across our country is full of bright and talented students who are ready to carry the torch of discovery and innovation well into the future. These students are the next generation of STEM leaders, and we must ensure that our work today provides equitable opportunity for everyone to become interested in and pursue STEM education and careers. The road ahead is not an easy one, and there is no one-size-fits-all answer. But I know that together, our collective impact will continue to lead us toward tangible outcomes and innovative approaches to providing and enhancing STEM education in all communities across the nation for years to come. So I want to thank you again for taking the time not only to be here, but taking the time to work in the Noyce program in your locations each and every day, and your willingness here to share your knowledge and expertise. Thank you for all the work that you do and continue to do to support our nation's STEM teachers and support students across our great country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to all of the NSF program officers and staff that have joined us not only today for the town hall, but will be joining us for the next several days. Your service and your leadership is extremely important to us and to the success of our programs, so we appreciate your efforts. Our next guest has been leading AAAS for just over 2 years. He assumed his post as CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and executive publisher of the Science family of journals just a month before the pandemic hit. So he too understands many of your challenges. Dr. Suda Parikh, who serves as our CEO, does not like a long intro, he's told me many times, but I do think that there's a couple things you might want to know. He's a native North Carolinian. He's a very proud father. Yeah, I heard that. You can cheer. He's a very proud father. He earned his Bachelor's of Science degree in Materials Applied Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and earned his doctorate in philosophy degree in molecular structure and chemistry from the Scripps Research Institute. Since his time coming to AAAS, he has made diversity, equity, and inclusion a continued priority for the association, and really at the heart of our work as we think about how we progress science and continue to serve society. So I welcome you, Dr. Parikh, and we're glad you joined us this evening.
Good evening, everybody. You know, I had a mentor a long time ago, and they said, if you get a chance, if you get the privilege to speak in front of a big group of people before they do important things, you've got some responsibilities. You've got some real pressure on you. Part of that is if you get that privilege, then you better be profound, because you don't want to waste their time. And if you can't be profound, then you've got a duty to be informative, because you want to give them information to work through whatever they're going to work through over the next few days. And if you can't be profound and you can't be informative, then you better darn well be brief. And so that is my plan this evening, is to be brief. My official job here tonight is to give you the official welcome from the AAAS. And so there you have it. Welcome. I want to welcome you to Washington. Yes. I want to welcome you to Washington. I want to welcome you, more importantly, to this community of principal investigators and researchers and teachers, educators. That is the more important place. Washington is wonderful, and I hope you have a chance to look around. It's a little humid this week. But more importantly, I want to welcome you to this community. Initiatives like the Noyce program are critical because they broaden participation in STEM, and they promote STEM education for all. I've written many times that insisting on inclusion neither sacrifices scientific excellence nor diminishes anybody else's accomplishments. To put it another way, highlighting the previously hidden doesn't in any way invalidate the already admired. But this change of thinking, it requires the scientific community to increase our attention as scientists, our attention and support for those who've been disadvantaged. And, you know, I've received lots of letters over my time as AAAS CEO. And some of those letters say things like, you know, race is not a scientific thing. And women are not excluded from things. So why don't you just keep on doing what you do? And what I say to that is that, yeah, you know, genetically, race isn't a big deal, but it turns out as a social construct, it's a huge deal. It turns out that patriarchy is real. It turns out that there are still instances of racism and sexism that are overt. But perhaps even more importantly, there are structural things that hold us back from drawing upon the brain power of everybody. And like our current interim science advisor to the president, Alondra Nelson, says, when you're programming the computer, when you are designing the clinical trial, when you are doing that next gadget for the future, it matters who you're thinking about when you program it. It matters what you bring to the table. And so it's incredibly important that we create the future scientists, the future clinicians, and also the future informed society that's going to live in that world. And that is up to you all. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the National Science Foundation. I want to thank Karen for her wonderful speech tonight. And I want to express our gratitude for the opportunity to reconvene the Noyce community after a couple of years, and our appreciation for the immense value that you all bring to the STEM community. Look, the changes that we make in the K-12 STEM community and education are going to affect us for generations to come. It's going to affect us for the next 20 years, next 40 years. And I have to tell you, we are in a race. We're in a race. We're in a race between the better angels of our nature that do things like the James Webb Telescope, or cure sickle cell anemia, which we're just about ready to do, or that are hopefully working on cures for Alzheimer's, or that are going to increase our understanding of dark matter. Those are the better angels of our nature. But we're in a race because it turns out that we also have some devils on our shoulder. And those devils on our shoulder are holding us back from addressing climate change. They're holding us back from protecting ourselves against pandemics. And they are holding us back from actually bringing our entire community into appreciating and enjoying the benefits of the science and engineering and technology that is all around us. And so we're in that race. And look, there's nobody that I would want in that race with me more than a science teacher. Because, I grew up in a small town in Hickory, North Carolina, and nobody ever told me about molecular biology until I got to my senior year in high school. And a high school teacher who convinced me that molecular biology was a thing and it might be worth learning about, convinced me to do that. And that's why I do what I do today. And we need our entire society to feel that pull of a teacher that tells you, you can do this too. So I am so proud to be associated with all of you, and I want to thank you for all your energy, your drive, and your passion. And I hope you have a wonderful couple of days, and I hope you go back out to the rest of the country and change it for us. Thank you.
For me, teaching is the noblest of professions. Without amazing teachers, our future is in jeopardy, quite honestly. Because this is where the next generation of everything is going to come from. And we're trying to produce the teachers that will make sure kids that have so much that they bring to the classroom won't slip through the cracks.
For the past 20 years, Noyce has helped develop a really deep understanding of what excellent K-12 STEM education looks like. Noyce, as a program, really equips K-12 STEM teachers to have that knowledge and to use that knowledge to the benefit of all of the students that those teachers touch.
We started with a relatively small program that people maybe thought, well, let's just give out some scholarships. But we shaped it, and the institutions that received the awards shaped it into a huge program with many unique aspects, expanded throughout the country. Many institutions have been brought in at all levels.
As an educator, I'm able to work with my colleagues in the math department and the environmental science department to support bringing in educators who want to continue to grow as scientists, but also want to grow as educators. So those collaborations and those partnerships that are built between the colleges of education and our science partners really does elevate that teaching profession.
We often put a lot of emphasis on pre-service teacher preparation, and I like to put equal emphasis on teacher retention, but also on developing teachers who are already our exemplary teachers in the field. But most recently, we also said, let's take a look at the research aspect of the work that we're doing around Noyce in terms of preparing and retaining effective teachers.
Noyce scholars have a high retention rate. Among ours, we have about 85% out of our 192 that have been through our program. And they're still teaching in high-need schools, some of them at school districts that are severely economically disadvantaged, and they are doing a phenomenal job impacting the lives of so many secondary school students.
Having a Noyce program, in a way, serves as an attractant for institutions to have much more diverse populations come into their programs. Knowing that this program aims to provide quality teaching for high needs areas will often attract people who come from rural areas, who come from urban areas, people from minoritized populations, people from other groups that see that there's an opportunity here to make a difference.
The main things that the Noyce program does It serves to remove barriers to entry. We have a serious access problem. We have a serious college debt problem. For students who are coming from backgrounds that are typically loaded up with debt, just coming to a 4-year institution to complete a teacher certification program almost seems like a fantasy.
From my experience, the most important thing that Noyce provides to the STEM education is actually a sense of community. Once you're in Noyce, you're always a Noyce scholar. We have an impact of sustainability on our graduates. They know that we're here for them and we support them no matter what they are involved in through their life transitions.
The fact that we at AAAS get to be a part of providing a space where Noyce PIs and co-PIs can build community, where they can problem solve with each other around tough issues, it's just really an honor.
I think that it's a network that you can tap basically later on at any particular time, where you can share with other educators across the country, learn their challenges, learn their wins, basically learn their triumphs, and consider testing those things out in your space.
What we have learned is that, yes, programs are shaped by the funding agencies, or in many cases, Congress, but really they are brought to success and to fruition through the awardees. And I think what we did at NSF was we stepped back and allowed these institutions to do their thing. And they came up with very novel ideas, which then they were able to disseminate so that other institutions were able to pick up on some of the approaches.
When I think about impacts, I think about the number of teachers that the program has touched, and then the number of students and other teachers and colleagues that Noyce Scholars and Fellows have touched. I'll just take one institution, for example, that has, for instance, 20 scholars, I'll say, and then those 20 scholars go on to teach hundreds of children. And our hope and our expectation is that they take everything that they've learned from the Noyce program and make an impact not only with their students, but with their colleagues as well.
In my mind, whoever thought about these programs 20, 30 years ago, I have to think that they were envisioning a kid like me. Leaving rural Georgia, Alabama State, Hampton University, Virginia Tech, now at the University of South Alabama, where I have multiple NSF projects, full professor within science education. I have to think that those programs were in part to give kids like me, a little small boy from rural Georgia, an opportunity. And so 20, 30 years from now, there are going to be some other full professors out there.
I'm a Star Trek fan, and I like to think about what does STEM education look like 200 years from now? We're zipping around the galaxy. But if we think about 20 years from now, I would like us to be working in a college debt-free, free tuition environment. If anybody who wanted to become a STEM teacher could become a STEM teacher.
The more we can invest in teachers, in bringing individuals who have strong backgrounds into the teaching profession, we will continue to strengthen the field of education, heighten the profession. It's not easy to be a teacher today.
I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. I am of an age that I lived in the segregated South, in the Jim Crow South. I only ever went to schools that were all black. I only ever had teachers who were all black. I lived through the civil rights era of the time, and in Birmingham, that included some pretty difficult times. I was captivated by Sputnik. I went to the University of Washington, which was a long way from Birmingham, and had to find my own place in science. So I understand how teachers can make a difference. I understand how teachers can inspire, how teachers can support, and how they can help students to see beyond the environments where they may find themselves, to be able to look at a much bigger world and much bigger possibilities.
I hope that we can continue to help teachers who can unleash the potential of so many of our students in the schools who really just need that teacher that would make it a point to speak to students on a one-to-one, like if, you answered this problem and solved this problem amazingly well. Have you ever thought about being an engineer? And have you ever thought about being a scientist?
As a physics teacher, I would say all forces occur in pairs, right? You can, object A acts on object B, and object B acts on object A. When you teach a student, the student teaches you. And I can think of no other profession out there where people have such monumental personal growth.
I am at heart a teacher. I think all of the principal investigators are teachers at heart. Obviously, our Noyce scholars and fellows are teachers at heart. And it takes a lot of heart to do this work. But if you think about the role of a heart in an organism, that's who our teachers are to our future.
Talent comes from all communities. And the talent to address the challenges that the world faces comes from all community. And the Noyce program develops talent scouts.
I'm not crying, you're crying. Thank you all again, and thank you to the many collaborators that help us put that video together, really to celebrate you all. You are amazing, and we're really, really excited to continue to celebrate you throughout this gathering and as we move into our keynote. Dr. Conra is an associate professor of teaching and teacher education at the College of Education at the University of Houston. Her research focuses on understanding the various types of programs, policies, and practices that support the development and advancement of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers in education systems. Dr. Gist is the award-winning author of Preparing Teachers of Color to Teach, Culturally Responsive Teacher Education in Theory and Practice, and editor of Portraits of Anti-Racist Alternative Routes to Teaching in the U.S., Framing Teacher Development for Community, Justice, and Visionaries. Her current projects include guest editing a 10-year retrospective issue of Teacher Education Quarterly on Grow Your Own programs. She also serves as leading principal investigator on several research projects. These include a national study on homegrown programs and Black teachers funded by a 2016 Spencer and National Academy of Education postdoctoral fellowship, and a project exploring teaching and learning experiences of teachers of color funded by a 2015 American Educational Research Association service grant. She also has chaired the Diversified Teaching Workforce Topical Action Group for the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education for the last 3 years. It is my privilege and honor to welcome Dr. Gist as our keynote speaker this evening.
So thank you so much for having me. It really is an honor and a privilege to be here. And a special thank you to the AAAS team just for bringing me here and giving me an opportunity to really center research on ethno-racial diversity. So the title of my talk is Advancing Equity in Teacher Development for a New Generation of Teachers. So we're looking at lessons from the Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color and Indigenous Teachers. And when I was thinking about an opportunity to speak with you, I was thinking very specifically about this being the 20-year anniversary. And so I'd like to frame my talk in 3 different ways. First, thinking about looking back as it relates to research on teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. So what have we actually learned? And then also thinking about celebrating the moment in terms of where we are right now. And then finally, imagining bold futures. Hopefully we leave out of here thinking about bold futures in terms of what is to come. So what do we imagine that work consisting of? So looking back, what have we learned? And very specifically right now, I'm thinking about the research on ethno-racial diversity. So really quickly, I always take for granted that everybody knows that ethno-racial diversity matters, but I thought that it was important to at least give the stats really quickly, just in case there are any doubters in the house, all right? So first of all, whenever we look at our nation's young children, over 50% of them are folks of color. But then whenever we look at the adult population, the number goes down to 37%. And then when we look very specifically at our educator workforce, which is really what we're about today, looking very specifically within the STEM disciplines, we look at that number just being at 19%. And that's really problematic whenever we think about being able to reach and teach all of our students. So then you may ask, well, what are the obstacles to this? Dr. Gibbs, why are we talking about this? This is like the third or fourth time I've heard this. Well, because the obstacles actually continue to persist. And it follows a pretty clear logic. First, there are K-12 structural barriers. And when you think about that and unpack it, it's connected to the fact that we have many unresponsive educators in our nation's schools. No one here, right? But across the board, that continues to be a challenge. There are also meager socioeconomic opportunities, and then students are also often kind of confronted with deficit and normalizing curriculum. What that means is the very group that we're trying to recruit from are being exposed to these kinds of schooling experiences. And if you're exposed to those types of schooling experiences, would you want to become a teacher? Not so much, right? And then if we make it through the schooling system and you get into the teacher education program, there are also structural barriers that exist there as well, in terms of looking at admittance policies that come up, looking at testing bias, in particular as it relates to certification exams, and also funding, which is what makes this program so phenomenal because it looks to disrupt one of the key barriers. But then, if they make it through the teacher education program, then they have to enter the schooling system to become teachers. And then there are more structural barriers there. Oftentimes, teachers of color and Indigenous teachers experience racial isolation. They're forced to teach a very rigid curriculum, which doesn't give them the kind of freedom that they'd like to be able to express in terms of being effective in the classroom. And they often have challenges in terms of their experiences with administrative leaders. On top of that, there are also policy challenges that come up in the work in terms of the massive closing of schools, and then also the dismissal of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers as well, which also becomes a problem. And then there's this broader issue, which I'm not going to unpack today as much, but really this other idea that we can't necessarily essentialize what we mean by teachers of color and Indigenous teachers as well. That we really have to look at the within-group diversity within and think about how we can actually tailor programs to meet their needs in an effective way. But all of that said, we talked about the barriers, but what we're really here to talk about, and what I think our handbook project focuses on, is the value of effective teachers of color. Let me emphasize that, effective teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. So we know that if students have access to effective teachers of color and Indigenous teachers, they have access to academic resources and opportunities they may not otherwise have. It means that they're going to be challenged by high expectations and their potential seen. What it means for a student to be seen for the first time in the classroom and to be able to see their genius. Oftentimes they're exposed to that with teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. We know that they also have an influence on graduation rate and non-academic factors as well, in terms of whether or not they show up to school or they participate in after-school programs. They serve as cultural bridge builders, and they also serve as role models and mentors as well. So I just kind of set the stage right there to say that we know that teachers of color actually matter in terms of effectiveness. But what we're trying to do with our handbook project is really take a look back. Remember, right now we're sort of looking back. And what was interesting for us is really looking at the wave of scholarship on teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. So if you look at it in the 1960s and 70s, we really, as a field, and I'm thinking about it from a scholarship perspective, we were really grappling with the aftermath of desegregation, and scholarship primarily focused on demographics. What are our numbers? Are we here or not, right? Then you start to see a little bit of a shift in the 80s where there's an outcry among scholars of color in particular, raising awareness of the disappearance and the absence and the need of more teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. And then people started to respond to the outcry in the 90s, looking very specifically at different recruitment strategies that are needed in terms of taking up this work. And then in the 21st century, really there's been an explosion of scholarship on teachers of color and Indigenous teachers, looking at expanding the focus on preparation, such as what the Noyce program is doing, but also looking at the impact on student outcomes, retention, professional development, policy, and studying local school context. And so I just situate that for you in terms of looking back because what I'm here to really talk about today is our effort around developing a research project, a handbook, a research handbook. And so the idea for developing a research handbook really came whenever we were looking at, well, what's actually available in the field? And so we were looking at past research handbooks, right? Everybody wants to grab the research handbook. You want to see what do we know in terms of the field. And my colleagues and I were looking around, and we couldn't see anything that was really out there dedicated to ethno-racial diversity. There were some really seminal pieces, such as Studying Teacher Education, the report of AERA Panel on Research in Teacher Education. Phenomenal book. Not so much looking at the experiences of ethno-racial diversity as it relates to what we know and don't know in the field. Same thing in terms of Handbook of Research on Teacher Education, Enduring Questions in a Changing Context. Love this handbook, and yet only a small portion was really dedicated to taking up this issue of what's happening as it relates to ethno-racial diversity. Same thing with the AERA published Studying Diversity in Teacher Education. You'll see that I list some of the chapters that deal with this topic, but on the whole, it wasn't necessarily looking at this idea of why teachers of color and Indigenous teachers actually matter. And so what we were finding is that there was a gap in the literature. So as we were looking back, trying to think about the way to go forward, we didn't see our scholarship represented in a way that really gave us competence that the field was going to take it up seriously. And so 5 years ago, this is me looking back, not 20 years ago, but 5 years ago, we asked the question, how can we extend and expand research on teachers of color and Indigenous teachers through the development of a research handbook? It was a pretty kind of simple ambition at the time. How can we take up that work? But it's definitely grown since then. And so what we did now, hot off the press, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, download it, make sure that you check it out. The Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color was to answer that gap in the research literature, in particular as it related to handbook research, right? I mean, there's a proliferation of scholarship that's come out on teachers of color, but oftentimes it's going in so many different directions and is not organized in a way to systematically think about what we know and do not know about domains of inquiry. And so our goal of advancing this project was to organize research scholars with expertise related to what we know and need to know about growing and sustaining ethno-racial diversity. And then this is, I think, the kicker and the kind of key contribution, that we wanted to develop research for each of the 11 domains of inquiry related to ethno-racial diversity. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And then I think this other part is important as well in terms of thinking about our efforts to disseminate and advance a research agenda across the teacher development continuum. And so in order to do that, we had 3 guiding questions that framed our work. The first was, what does research say about supports and structures that guide teachers of color and Indigenous teachers across the teacher development continuum? What does it actually say? What does it say about the barriers that prevent teachers of color and Indigenous teachers' successful matriculation along the teacher development continuum? And then finally, what does the research say about program, pedagogy, and policy changes that are needed in order to recruit, support, and retain teachers of color and Indigenous teachers? And so this is really, I think, one of our key contributions in terms of thinking about how do we organize the research in ways that really kind of make sense for us. As was said in the video, I think it's Dr. Richardson who mentions this idea of there was such a focus on recruitment that we realized we need to focus on retention. And then I think for my colleagues in particular, oh my God, I believe I haven't done it. Shout out to the Dr. Travis J. Bristol, who's my co-editor for this work, who has been phenomenal in terms of developing this project with me. One of the things that we discovered is that we have to move beyond just talking about even recruitment and retention and think about what are all the different domains of inquiry that we need to understand well in order to really make sure that we're recruiting, preparing, placing, sustaining, growing, developing teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. And so we look at recruitment, we look at preparation, we look at minority serving institutions, and this is a shout out to Dr. Leslie Fenwick, who reached out to us and said, you need to think more clearly about the contribution of MSIs to scholarship on teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. And so we invited her to serve as a section editor for that work. And then also, we wanted to think very specifically about the contribution of human resource development and induction. What do we know about that work? What do we know about mentorship and professional development and intersectionality if we really take to heed this idea that we don't want to think about all teachers of color and all Indigenous teachers as a monolithic group? how do we unpack race, gender, class, location, and how these different experiences influence effectiveness and our ability to be able to be successful in the classroom? And then I think the research domain that really has taken off the most is this focus on educational impact. Having a teacher of color, creates this impact. And that's okay, right? But what we were really sort of curious about with this is not necessarily just thinking about academic outcomes, but also thinking about a sense of belongingness, the kind of relationships that they're able to cultivate with their peers in the broader community. And so in order to really do that well, we needed to understand what are the pedagogical and leadership practices that teachers of color and Indigenous teachers are taking up. Often that's missing from the conversation in terms of really trying to understand what makes them most effective. Obviously, retention is the issue, and policy as well. And so what we do is we have these 11 domains of inquiry that are integrated together because we see them as all interlocking. Someone first reached out to Travis and I and said, hey, you know what, you should just write about teachers of color in general. You don't need to necessarily break them down in terms of these different domains of inquiry. And for us, this was really key because there could be a school district leader who's really interested in how do I do professional development well? And they really wanted to dig down and figure out what does the research say? Or there's an up-and-coming doctoral student in STEM who wants to look very specifically at what's happening in terms of mentorship. This provides a framework to make sense of how to take up that work in a very intentional way. And so what this handbook consists of is chapter introductions that features a review of literature, themes across the chapters, and looks at implications for future research. And then the 11 domains of inquiry each have anywhere from 4 to 7 chapters of research studies. And I'm going to talk about 4 of those sections today. And then the handbook concludes with the research agenda. And the research agenda is important to me because ultimately we want to know what questions should we be asking in terms of moving the field forward, what research topics should we be focused on, and what type of studies should we be taking up. I think too often we get caught up in generating research just for the sake of generating it, and we wanted to be intentional about being able to direct the field in some way. And then we also end with policy recommendations. And so that was looking back. So fast forward 5 years later, here we are celebrating the moment. So where are we now? And for us, where we are is the release of the handbook project. And so what I want to share, I cannot go over all 11 domains of inquiry in the time that I have here, but I did want to spotlight 4 as a way to begin unpacking what we know in terms of research themes. What are some of the research topics that we need to focus on? And then what are possible policy and practice implications? And this is a point to celebrate because 5 years ago this didn't exist. And what this means is now we have a charge to think about how we can move forward as it relates to advancing ethno-racial diversity in the teaching workforce. So the first area that I'm going to focus on is program design. And I chose this because I think it's relevant in terms of thinking about the Noyce program. And so in terms of thinking about program design, we focus on that because educator preparation programs are critical stakeholders since they play a vital role in developing and preparing teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. And I guess I have to emphasize that my colleague, Dr. Bristol and I, we edited this volume, but we had leading scholars across the 11 domains of inquiry actually review the studies and give feedback and so on. And so this particular section was led by Dr. Felicia Moore-Menza and Dr. Thomas Phillip. And so what I'm going to do in each one of these sections really quickly is we're going to look to the right first and just say there are 4 new studies in this section. The first study is a review of literature that looks very specifically at themes that come out of program design. The second looks specifically at candidate experience. The third looks at features of program design. And then finally, the fourth one looks at teacher educators. So now let's look to the left. So the first part is looking at what were some of the outcomes in terms of the review of literature. One of the things that they found, which isn't surprising, but I think is really important sometimes whenever we're a part of audiences like this where we know that folks have a commitment to ethno-racial diversity, that we think that maybe everybody else is thinking the same thing. But in their review of literature, what they really found is that most programs still have yet to take significant steps to acknowledge that teacher education is an overwhelmingly white field, or to recognize the ways in which racism and racial exclusion actually impact teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. Right? And so that was one of sort of their key initial themes. The other piece is looking very specifically at the experiences of BIPOC teacher candidates. One of the things that the second study found is that, that they weren't necessarily shy about wanting to learn more about justice and equity, but they were clamoring for opportunities to be able to do more of this work in the context of their teacher education programs, and they weren't being exposed to opportunities to do that work. They also found that they really wanted to be able to inform the design and structure of teacher education programs, but they weren't often given the opportunity to be able to do that work. The third study looks very specifically at this idea of reimagining design. And what came out of this study was that in a local school district, they wanted to be able to implement an ethnic studies program, but they weren't necessarily able to do it because they didn't have any teachers who were prepared to take up that work. And so one of the things that they did is they partnered with the local teacher education program to think about what it would actually look like to be able to teach ethnic studies in a way that has integrity and also would be responsive to the needs of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. And then finally, the last study in this section looks very specifically at the impact of teacher educators. And what it asks us to do is think a little bit about, well, who's preparing the teacher educators? More importantly, who's preparing the teacher educators of color and Indigenous teacher educators? Are they having opportunities in the context of their doctoral programs to really know how to work effectively with teachers of color and Indigenous teachers? And that's one of the things that this study actually calls out, is it causes us to begin thinking a little bit about what do those preparation strategies and structures look like? And so then from there, what we do is we kind of feature the studies in terms of talking about research themes, but then we think very specifically about research topics, right? What are the topics that are really important related to this work? So the first is thinking about topics to explore, the differences in how program types are tailored for teachers of color and Indigenous teachers, with a particular focus on interdisciplinary implications and also thinking about the role of intersectionality in this work. The other topic is thinking very specifically about how to promote community-centered teacher development and to articulate theories of racial justice that undergird program design. That we can't necessarily wait and think about, well, somebody else is doing this program change somewhere, maybe we'll learn from them and do it. But we really sort of have to think about how do we take up this work in practice. The other topic that kind of comes out of the work is thinking very specifically about race, language, and class disparities related to recruit student debt and also licensure exam scores, that we need to know much more about that work in the future, right? How do we make sure that we're actually effective in terms of licensure exams? And then one of the things, again, that's great about this program is it begins to address some of the student debt issues as well. And then finally, in terms of program design, we need to know more specifically about the impact of teacher diversity program intervention strategies. For example, the impact of course articulation agreements and also scholarships in terms of being able to actually retain folks in our teacher education program. And so that's kind of on one side in terms of thinking about the actual topics that we need to explore. And then on the other side, we think very specifically about the kind of policy or practices that are needed. So for example, grow your own programs and year-long teacher residencies are great places to begin around this work. So thinking about that design and model as it relates to teachers of color, Indigenous teachers. And then also thinking about the design and implementation of courses that prepare teachers of color and Indigenous teachers for the teaching profession that are related to ethnic studies, identity development, racial literacy, and teacher activism. One of the things that we found in this particular section is that this is the kind of preparation experiences that teachers of color actually value and want to see more in their practice. And the last piece is providing opportunities for teaching candidates to form affinity groups where they can actually talk about some of the challenges that they're experiencing in the context of the field. So the next area is thinking about human resource and development induction. And one of the reasons that we focus on this is so often the work that we're doing around program design is completely divorced from what's happening in terms of actually placing teachers. And so whenever we define this particular research domain, we think about it as schools and districts as critical stakeholders for recruitment and retention, since they play a role in the selection, hiring, placement, and ongoing support of teachers of color, Indigenous teachers. And this particular section was headed up by Drs. Francisco Rios and Desiree Couto. And so there are 4 studies that we feature in this particular section. The first study looks very specifically at how to form strategic partnerships related to human resource development. And the second, third, and fourth study look specifically at impacts as it relates to induction programs. So thinking about the composition of the racial composition in schools and how that actually impacts the way that teachers of color and Indigenous teachers experience school settings. Also looking at the impact of mandatory induction programs on teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. And then finally thinking about teacher or community-led induction programs. So those were kind of the focus of these 4 new studies in this particular area. And then in terms of research themes around this work that came out, the first is when we're thinking about school districts, that they need to think strategically about teaching placements and assignments, provide high quality induction and mentoring, and build capacity among school leaders to support these teachers. That's kind of the first theme. And then the second, which I think is deeply problematic in some ways, but is a reality, is that teachers of color and Indigenous teachers feel highly visible and scrutinized by colleagues, and at the same time, invisible and unheard when it comes to their perspectives on teaching and learning. And so that's a tough place to be in. You're seen, but not really heard in terms of valuing your perspective and impact. The other piece is the importance of systematically addressing barriers. It does no good for us in terms of our programs to focus on recruitment and preparation, but not think very specifically about how to go about addressing barriers as it relates to the recruitment, selection, and hiring of teachers. And what that means in terms of a framework is making sure that we have tailored support in human resource management that effectively addresses the unique challenges that teachers of color and Indigenous teachers actually face. And so there are 2 areas on this side. First, thinking about what are the research topics, and on the other side, thinking about the implications for policy and practice. So first, in terms of thinking about the research topics to explore, it's really as a field thinking about how do we value the personal assets and professional characteristics of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers in the selection and induction process. We think about what does it mean to form and sustain informal induction networks in the absence of adequate and responsive induction supports? We also think about how can human resource leaders foster equitable systems for teacher development, in particular as it relates to what's happening with novice teachers, mid-career teachers, and veteran teachers. And then also significantly more research on the ways in which teachers of color and Indigenous teachers find voice, agency, and support as they navigate race and racism in their school settings. How do you take up that work? There also needs to be a use of a range of social networks, understanding what that actually looks like and how that supports them over the course of their induction years. And then finally, thinking about the critical preparation and development of human resource development and induction leaders. How are we actually preparing leaders to take up this work? I think one of the things that's interesting is there are a lot of things within this where folks take these ideas for granted and aren't thinking specifically about the kind of research that we need to understand it better. And then on the flip side, in terms of thinking about policy and practice, it's really thinking about the use of critical theoretical and conceptual orientations related to race, justice, and education reform to really understand how to be effective in our human resource development processes. Also thinking about, as it relates to practice, school districts, in partnership with educator preparation programs, developing interlocking systems of support within human resource development that looks at supporting teachers from recruitment, selection, hiring, placement, and induction. And then also thinking very specifically about routine assessments that are taking place in the context of human resource development. How are the voices of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers centered in this work? Where are they in the conversation about the kinds of designs that we actually need to be implementing? And how do we, as teacher educators, folks who are committed to teacher development, engaging in conversations with the districts to find ways to actually center their voice as a way of informing how we reimagine what human resource development looks like? And then finally, we need to develop protocols to prepare human resource development leaders and induction specialists with critical theoretical and conceptual orientations of race, justice, and education. The reason this matters is that these are the folks who are taking up this work. So we're doing all of this kind of hard work on the front end, right? Then we're transitioning to what's happening in HR. How are they being prepared? How are they being challenged to actually take up this work? And if we're not necessarily doing that with integrity, that's going to have an impact in terms of long-term sustainability of teachers of color in the profession. And the other area that I want to kind of uplift, and I want to make sure that I get to this for time. I think I might leave this one for now. Is thinking about this idea of mentorship. that mentorship offers a pedagogical, curricular, and effective support at different stages of teacher development. And when we think about mentorship, we have to think about it specifically as it relates to teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. Not just thinking about mentorship for mentorship's sake, right? But thinking very specifically about what practices are actually effective. And so this particular section is headed up by Dr. Berlinda Bustos-Flores, Socorro Herrera, and Lorena Kleiss. And in this particular section, there were 3 studies that were featured or highlighted as it related to the kinds of things that we need to be working on. The first is thinking very specifically about the mentorship experiences of novice teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. And these 2 points really matter, and I think that we just don't know enough about this in the research in terms of how we actually take up this work. What does culturally sustaining and humanizing practices actually look like? What does critical approaches and authentic care look like in the context of strong mentorship networks? How do we take up that work with integrity? And then the second part, which is the third study in here, is thinking very specifically about how we actually prepare mentors to work with BIPOC educators. How are they prepared to actually take up this work? And so when we think about the 3 themes, they kind of were an outgrowth of those studies, thinking specifically about mentorship models that we know are going to be able to be effective and make visible the experiences of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. Most of the studies in this particular section use teacher testimony, storytelling, counter-narratives to really center their voices, but we need significant more studies that use different methodological frameworks. And then also, we need to think very specifically about this idea of critical mentoring. Well, what does that mean? And are we engaged in those practices in terms of our work? This is an approach that seeks out and learns from the diverse perspectives about the challenges BIPOC educators are actually facing and the kinds of mentorship that they actually need. A lot of this is about seeing BIPOC educators, thinking about the research that we actually know related to this scholarship. And then in terms of topics, they kind of flow in the same way, thinking very specifically about the kind of frameworks that we need for effective mentorship. Thinking about the different kind of mentorship models. So thinking about what school-based mentoring looks like versus community mentoring versus co-mentoring versus informal mentoring. All these different components of the work, right? Also thinking about the different kinds of learning orientations that are important in this work. Things that we typically overlook in terms of thinking about a critical constructivist approach, a humanistic approach, a critical race of social justice approach, and thinking about situated apprenticeship models. All of these kinds of things are the kinds of work that we really have to be able to unpack thoughtfully and with integrity. And then also, I hope you're seeing how deep the work goes, right, in terms of mentorship, that we just say, oh, we're gonna have good mentors. But there's so many layers in terms of really understanding the research of what we were trying to do. And that was really the mission of what we were hoping to accomplish with this project, is thinking very specifically about the kind of lenses that we need to be looking at around this domain of inquiry. Also thinking very specifically about the selection and hiring of mentors. What do we know about that in terms of what it looks like? And then also thinking about the ways in which it's tailored to tap strengths. And then finally, thinking about policy and practice implications. So thinking about how do we actually develop, in terms of practice, culturally responsive and sustaining mentors that recognize their own identity and position and privilege in this work and do it in a way that's going to be effective. And then also, how do we actually engage in the process of critical mentoring that centers the personal and professional experiences of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers? And then finally, I really like this last bullet under policy and practice, even though it's long, but it gets at more or less what it is that we're trying to cultivate. And ultimately, I think from the research literature, it says that we're trying to cultivate culturally responsive and sustaining mentors who create communities of practice that are safe, trusting, and non-evaluative spaces for dialogue about instructional concerns, power dynamics, and ethno-racial and social injustices. These communities also prioritize discussions about the teacher's personal and professional goals. And so that's an overview in terms of thinking about research themes, topics, policy, and practice across these 3 different areas. And I want to just transition for time, because I feel like I'm starting to run down here, to thinking about celebrating the moment where we are now. So that's what we were just talking about now, right? Celebrating the moment. You guys look quiet on me, but this is a celebration. The research is a celebration. The research is a celebration. 5 years ago, this didn't exist at all. We were just talking about recruitment and retention. We weren't drilling down to figure out what are all the guiding research questions that we need to ask. All these topics didn't exist. You guys are looking like, oh God, how many more topics are there? That's right. There's a lot of topics. There are a lot of research themes. There are a lot of policy and practices that we should be exploring. That's the whole point. And if we don't systematically investigate it with integrity, we're not going to have the long-term impact that we want. We're just going to continue to have the same conversations. Oh, well, I hope we get more this year. I tried to contact this person for recruitment, instead of really thinking about developing a systematic research agenda. And I understand that everybody is not going to be as passionate about this topic as I am and maybe my colleagues are. But what we hope that you're able to see is the way that you can use this research agenda to kind of dive down in a particular area that you might really need to confront, that you really might need to take an honest look at. And so this I see as a celebration right now, even though it's just the presenting of scholarship. And so where I think we are right now, really, and I think everybody is here now, hopefully you're thinking about this. It's the very beginning of this, what is this, two and a half day long institute, thinking about what it means to imagine bold futures. What do we imagine for our futures? Maybe part of it is, can we get excited and like motivated and just deeply inspired around the research that we do? I mean, really, because I realize that's kind of my thing. I nerd out on research. I love it. I'm glad that I can be employed to do this work and to take it up with integrity. And part of doing that is imagining bold futures. The Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color and Indigenous Teachers, that's a dream project. 5 years in the making in terms of being able to pull together such a phenomenal group of scholars. And so what we try to do is end with a set of recommendations within this handbook that points us towards a way forward. And one of the first things that we say is that race and racism comes up across all 11 domains. I didn't present on all 11 domains because you guys might throw tomatoes at me, but I did present on 3. And I talked about it because the structural implications of race and racism are a salient topic that is not going to go away. It comes up in every single area. The other area that we think is critically important is the holistic and humanistic support that needs to be developed. That's no longer a side topic. The pandemic has certainly taught us that. And we have to think about new ways to reimagine what induction, mentorship, professional development looks like. We need to start putting more investments in those areas as well, or equal investments in those areas, right? And I just have to read the sentence because it's so true. The lives of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers are not shielded from the historical legacy and material effects of social inequity as they navigate along the career trajectory. They're not just blind to it, not experiencing it. Every day, going out in this school, they experience these things. I experience these things. And so we have to see it in the context of our research. Thinking very specifically about this idea of intersectionality and really thinking about the various standpoints in which teachers of color and Indigenous teachers come to this work. The point of educational impact, I think, is really important. A lot of the hype around ethno-racial diversity is around, if we have a Black teacher in the classroom, it's going to produce these kind of outcomes. That's great because it's caused people to take this serious. But the real work is really understanding what's happening in that particular context. What's happening with their pedagogical practices? What are the working conditions? How is this work actually being able to thrive? We need to know much more about that. If our research just stops there and has effect studies and impact studies and nothing else, we're going to be really poor as a field, not going to be able to really move on from this topic with integrity, right? The other thing in terms of design and methodological recommendations, and this is at the end of the talk, right, in terms of thinking about research agenda, where do we go next, is thinking very specifically about design and methodological recommendations because we want to take up our research in different ways. How are we centering the experiences of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers in our research? I mean, centering, really truly centering. Voices heard. Structural disparities being challenged. Talking about it in the context of being teacher educators, of being one of the only, maybe in a predominantly white department. What does that feel like? How are we talking about that in the context of our research? And the other thing, I know I was right at home when I picked up my track 4 book, talking about research practice partnerships. One of the things that I found in my work is that it gets really discouraging to do research in isolation. You're doing this study, you think it's brilliant, but you might be the only one, or maybe the other 5 people that read that study. But whenever you lock arms with the district and stakeholders and leaders, you have the opportunity to network with your colleagues here, all of a sudden you can build something beautiful that really matters. And I know it sounds kind of hokey, but I can't get inspired about research if I can't believe it can change things. Otherwise, what are we doing it for? And so I believe that research practice partnerships are a vehicle to take up that type of work. It's not the only way, but it's definitely an important way. The same thing is in terms of thinking about mixed method studies. I said it before. We need really robust methodological studies going forward. We can't have these flat studies that just look at one dimension of what it means to be effective. That's not going to help the field move forward. And then finally, the last recommendation as it relates to methods is thinking very specifically about the marriage between interpretive studies and intervention studies. Not necessarily interpreting what's happening in the field, going and writing about it, but interpreting what's in the field, connecting that to design-based intervention, and then seeing how that actually creates some kind of change, and then creating an iterative cycle where you continue to take up that work over time. That's the kind of research that we really need to be able to advance teachers of color and Indigenous teachers in terms of being able to keep them in profession. And then the last part is infrastructure recommendations. I talk about the National Center for Research on Educator Diversity. I'm going to close with that. Also, the importance of cross-organizational partnerships. Part of this work is also not having organizations work in isolation, making sure that AERA is talking to AACTE, is talking to NSF, and thinking about how do you pull sources together around this work. And I think that that's particularly important because some less well-funded organizations have deep roots in terms of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers, strong bases. Others do not. How do you join forces to be able to do this work with integrity? The other piece is research development programs, making sure the folks who are actually taking up this scholarship are also folks of color and Indigenous people, that there's representation and that they know how to do the work well. And then finally, funding. You're the product of funding right here, but thinking very specifically about funding, not just at the national or federal level, but also thinking about local, state, and university. And so the closing slide is this. When we think about a radical reimagining, without new visions, we do not know what to build. We only know what to knock down. We only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical. But we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers or tactics, but a process that can and must transform us, right? Really thinking about what radical imagination looks like, something that really wakes us up and gets us excited about how to take up this research. And so for us, and kind of how I find myself standing before you today, is because the Handbook Project was that effort that's influencing over 100 scholars who helped to put together that handbook, and we have great hopes for what will happen in the year to come with its release and our different dissemination projects. But that's also involved the creation of a pilot study, which is the National Center of Research on Educator Diversity, the outgrowth of that initial DREAM project around these efforts, and then also the development of the Community Teacher Equity Development Program, which is a local RPP that's looking very specifically at how do we actually grow teachers of color and Indigenous teachers in the workforce. And what you see here is the outgrowth of research. So thinking about the strands here, it talks about creating safe spaces for teachers of color to grow and foster competencies, thinking about what that looks like, thinking very specifically about offering psychosocial emotional supports tailored to their needs, cultivating teachers' coping and resilient strategies, very specific about what that looks like in practice. And then finally, thinking about fostering communities of practice among teachers of color through responsive and tailored co-teaching and mentorship. And so those were the dream projects for me. I talked about what we've learned. I talked about where we are now, that it's a moment of celebration. And then I also talked about imagining our futures, right? In this case, talking about the National Center and talking about the Community Teacher Equity Development Program. So now I put it back on you in terms of Noyce, 20 years of Noyce. What have we learned? Where are we now in this moment? Are we pumped? Do we feel like we're part of a revolution and a mission and a vision, that we're lucky and privileged and honored to be in this space right now, knowing that legacy work is being built? And then finally, and most important, Noyce, what do you imagine for your future? Thank you.
So thank you all for bearing with us as we started a little late. We do have about 10 minutes for questions, and I'll help facilitate those. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your passion with us, your nerdiness with us. It It's really inspiring, and we're so thankful for you and for your colleagues' immense time and energy putting this work in. There are a couple places where if you have a question, there's a couple ways you can provide those questions. One, we have 2 standing mics right up here, 2 circle tables in, if anybody wants to come up to ask a question directly. You can also submit questions in the Whova app in the Q&A of the plenary session, which I've been monitoring. So I know you all are eager to get to poster sessions. I won't keep you too long, but we do want to give a quick moment in case there are questions. You also get leaderboard points, for Q&A. I'm just saying. I see you all on the leaderboard. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Justin Baumuth. I'm from Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. I loved your presentation. That was absolutely wonderful. One question that I have for you is, obviously today we're in a interesting situation in our country where censorship is happening in our schools. And I'm worried personally about that slippery slope. And I was wondering if you have any comments on that, and if you were thinking of doing any research on that in the future, especially in thinking about how censorship in schools can impact minority outcomes and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. Thank you so much for your question. To me, in many ways, it's somewhat connected, although it is definitely worse now. But part of the push out that we were seeing related to retention for teachers of color and Indigenous teachers is that they were functioning in administrative contexts where they weren't able to use their voice and agency in a way that really allowed them to be able to thrive. And so now I just kind of look at it as something that's increasingly more difficult for folks. But the way that we get around that is really making sure that we actually create the kinds of communities of practice that allow teachers of color and Indigenous teachers to be able to resist and fight back. We plug them into professional networks like iTalk. We connect with teacher advocacy groups. And I know it's maybe an unpopular opinion, but I really believe in teacher unions and partnering with them in ways that have integrity and thinking about what that looks like. And so I think that part of what we do is we get creative in our partnerships. We look at our allies, right? Because what happens, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, especially if you're kind of racially isolated in some ways, is that you can really despair, in a sense. You think I'm kind of the only one. And so part of the strategy is to be able to link intentionally with community. But that's also why, as program designers and leaders, we need to get ahead of that and think about what kind of affinity groups or spaces am I offering for students. Even if you don't have representation at your particular school, you should be giving some kind of resources to give folks life and possibility. And we have to, I think, intentionally create those things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Austin Swindler. I'm an upcoming teacher. I just finished my master's degree at University of South Carolina. Very excited for that. And my question is actually, and this is something I always love to ask whenever I hear these amazing ideas that a lot of people come to present at these conferences. I just got done with the Alabama conference and I asked a very similar question to this. But how can we actually, like I said, I'm an upcoming math teacher, and I'm wondering how can we sort of introduce these ideas of diversity, like in our classroom? Like, what would that physically look like in the classroom? If I'm deciding one day, hey, I'm teaching algebra and I need to teach an algebra lesson that day, well, I only have about an hour within that day to teach that lesson. What can I do within that hour-long lesson to introduce, like I said, themes of diversity?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that part of the chart, which is why, again, I think this research is so important, part of what I presented was on program design. And I'm sure you noticed one of the recommendations in terms of research was thinking very specifically about how do we actually prepare teachers to take up that work with integrity. So I think part of the onus falls on our teacher development programs to think about what that work looks like so that you don't have to come out and ask the question of what do I do, I'm not sure, but you've received the kind of preparation that you actually need in order to be effective around the work. And at the same time, I think that our school systems who are also committed to justice and equity should be working with you to think about those things as well. I think it's kind of it's a reality, but it's also kind of sad that we wonder how can we kind of take up this work, which is so real, whenever our program should be doing that work. That should be one of the outcomes, is that we have teachers who can take up that work with integrity whenever they graduate. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have questions zooming in virtually as well. We will try to get to as many of your questions as we can. We won't be able to get to all of them. But there are two questions that have come up specifically around subpopulations, both questions around wondering if some of your research or your colleagues' research has, have any come up specifically around your use of Indigenous teachers to also include Aboriginal teachers? And two, there was a question specifically about, here we go. Did any of your research also uncover intersectionalities with LGBT plus teachers?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So one of the things that, and I'll attempt to answer this, and I wish now I had a couple of my other colleagues here, but I can answer both of them in terms of how I've seen the work. So first, you'll notice that if you look at the wave of scholarship on teachers of color, you see that kind of primarily it just says teachers of color, right? And one of the things that we were trying to do is to make sure that we were being intentional around kind of language. And so we began to talk to some of our critical Indigenous colleagues to think about, one, is this language in fact inclusive? And if it is not, what should it actually be? And so, and we've actually experienced some pushback from our own colleagues around, well, you know we always meant everybody whenever we said teachers of color, so why would you change it? But that change is actually an outgrowth of our conversation with our colleagues, our critical Indigenous colleagues, that really pushed us to think deeply about that. And we would say that that's not the only way to think about the framing. I mean, that's what's difficult about using a group standpoint, is that it's hard to make sure that everybody's included, but we tried, or represented, but we tried to do that in that shift of language and are open to other ideas in terms of what that looks like. And yes, we do have a couple of studies in our professional development section that look very specifically at the experiences of Black queer women educators in terms of the kind of professional development supports that they actually need. And also in the context of our intersectional, so that's kind of thinking about professional development, and definitely several studies in our intersectionality section that take up those questions. Specifically looking at how we actually prepare teachers through a methods course that looks at queer studies. So there are definitely some areas. What's difficult whenever we were trying to come up with research themes? So hard. Because part of what we're doing is all the nuance and details in terms of what we find, and then we sort of give these overarching themes. But that's definitely, that's a great question. That's also, those voices are also represented in our handbook as well.
Thank you again, Conra. We really appreciate your time and energy.
Thank you.